Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. And here we meet again for lecture 2 of novel 2, that is modern novel. If you would remember, we left our first lecture with the note that we will continue the detailed discussion, the detailed talk on modernism and realism in our second lecture. So here we are today to do the discussion, the due discussion. We will start today's talk with the conclusive discussion on modernism and realism. Then we will move on to novel as a genre, and we will discuss the elements of novel, how the novel has evolved, how novel is defined. We will see how it is unique form of literature, and what are the characteristics that differentiate a novel from a short story. We will also discuss the history of the novel, particularly history of British novel, and then we will focus on the modern novel. When we are discussing novel, we need to understand what are different types of modern novel, such as epic, narrative versus fiction, irony, allusion-based, picaresque, realism, modernism, postmodernism, naturalism, non-participant, datary novel. And once we are done with this discussion, we will start with our very first writer that we are going to cover is James Joyce, period from 1882 to 1941. That is a writer of early 20th century. And we will discuss James Joyce as a writer and particular relevance with modernism. And we will discuss how does he portray modernism, the characteristics of his work, and we will have a detailed review of the famous works done by James Joyce. So let us start with today's talk, lecture 2. What is this concept of modernism? Lecture 1 gave you pretty much a kind of comprehensive discussion about 20th century, the move from 19th century into 20th century, the reasons, the kind of thoughts prevailing in that time, the thinkers, the philosophers, the themes, and all these things, all tiny, I would say the tiny components which are basically building up and joining to be this concept of modernism. So we will conclude all of that discussion and we'll try to see what could we understand so far. So the term modernism refers to the radical shift in aesthetic as well as cultural sensibility evident in the art as well as literature of the post-World War I period. The ordered, stable and inherently meaningful worldview of the 19th century, the Victorian age, could not, wrote T.S. Eliot, accord with the immense panorama of fertility and anarchy which is contemporary history. Modernism thus makes a distinctive break with Victorian age and its morality, rejecting 19th century optimism. We discussed that it is highly pessimistic in nature. They presented a profoundly pessimistic picture of a culture in disarray. This despair often results in an apparent apathy and moral relativism. That is the spirit of modernism. In literature, the movement is associated with the works of, among others, Eliot, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, W.B. Yeats, Ezra Pound, Gertrude Stein, H.D., Franz Kafka, and Hamsun. In their attempt to throw off the aesthetic burden of the realist novel, these writers introduced a variety of literary tactics and devices. Here is the extract from the Literature of Replenishment. It says, the radical disruption of linear flow of narrative, the frustration of conventional expectations concerning unity and coherence of plot and character and the cause and effect development thereof, the development of ironic and ambiguous juxtaposition, to call into question the moral and philosophical meaning of literary action, the adoption of a tone of epistemological self-mockery aimed at naive pretensions of bourgeois rationality, the opposition of inward consciousness to rational public objective discourse, and an inclination to subjective distortion to point up the evanescence of the social world of the 19th century. Now, modernism is often derided for abandoning the social world in favor of its narcissistic interest in language and its processes. Recognizing the failure of language to ever fully communicate meaning, that's not what I meant at all. Lemons Eliot J. Alfred Prufrock says, the modernists generally downplayed content in favor of an investigation of form. They're not really highly in love with the use of language as a complete communicator of meaning, or an ample, at least an ample communicator of meaning. The fragmented, non-chronological, poetic forms utilized by Eliot and Ezra Pound revolutionized poetic language. So modernist formalism, however, was not without its political cost. Many of the chief modernists either flirted with fascism or openly espoused it. For example, Eliot, Yeast, Hampson, and Pound. This should not be surprising to see that modernism is markedly non-egalitarian. It's disregarded for the shared conventions of meaning make many of its supreme accomplishment. You will see Eliot's work, The Wasteland, Pound's, Cantor's Choice, Fingers, and Woolf's, The Waves, famous for that. These are largely inaccessible to the common reader. For Eliot, such obscurantism was necessary to halt the erosion of art in the edge of commodity circulation and a literature adjusted to the lowest common denominator. It could be argued that the achievements of the modernists have made little impact on the practices of reading and writing, as those terms and activities are generally understood. So this was the modernism in looking to carry on many of the aesthetic goals of the modernist project. Hypertext fiction must confront again the politics of its achievements in order to position itself anew with regard to reader. With its reliance on expensive technology and its interest in rethinking the linear nature of the book, hypertext fiction may find itself accused of the same elitism and its modernist predecessors. So, from here, stepping into the reality novel introduced in modern novel was, realism is an aesthetic mode which broke with the classical demands of art to show life as it should be in order to show life as it is. The work of realist art tends to eschew the elevated subject matter of tragedy in favor of the quotidian, the average, the commonplace, the middle classes and their daily struggles with the mean varieties of everyday existence. These are the typical subject matters of realism. So the attempt, however, to render life as it is, to use language as a kind of undistorting mirror of or perfectly transparent window to the the real is fraught with contradictions. Realism in this simplified sense must assume a one-to-one relationship between the signifier, the word, tree for example, and the thing it represents, the actual arboreal object typically found in forest. So realism must, in effect, discuss its own status as artifice, must try and force language into transparency through an appeal to our ideologically constructed sense of the real. The real is not what we see, the real is something else. The reader must be addressed in such a way that he or she is always in some way saying, yes, that's it, that's how it really is. And realism can never fully offer up the world in all its complexity. Realism cannot capture all of it. Its irreducible plentitude, its verisimilitude, it is an effect achieved through the deployment of certain literary and ideological conventions which have been invested with a kind of truth value. So the use of an omniscient narrator who gives us access to a character's thought, feelings and motivations, for example, is a highly formalized convention that produces a sense of psychological depth. And this comes from Sigmund Freud. The characters seem to have lives independent of the text itself. They, of course, do not. The sense that they do is achieved entirely by the fact that both the author and the reader share these codes of the real. The consensual nature of such codes is so deep that we forget that we are in the presence of fiction, and fiction stands as real, as Terry Eagleton notes. That's what Terry Eagleton says. So the sign as reflection, expression or representation denies the productive character of language. It suppresses the fact that what we only have a world at all because we have language to signify it. A world is a lot more than language that signifies all of it, all of its complexity. So the realist novel first developed in the 19th century and is the form we associate with the work of writers such as Austen, George Eliot and Tolstoy. According to Barthes, the narrative or plot of a realist novel is structured around an opening enigma which throws the conventional cultural and signifying practices into disarray. In a detective novel, for example, the opening enigma is usually a murder or a theft. So the event throws the world into a paranoid state of suspicion. The reader and the protagonist can no longer just trust anyone because signs, people, objects, words no longer have the obvious meaning they had before the event. So the event has changed the reality entirely. But the story must move inevitably towards closure, which in the realist novel involves some dissolution or resolution of the enigma. The murderer is caught eventually and the case is solved. The hero marries the girl. That is the traditional order. The realist novel, however, drives toward the final re-establishment of harmony and thus reassures the reader that the value system of science and cultural practices which he or she shares with the author is not in danger. The political affiliation of the realist novel is thus evident. In trying to show us the world as it is, it often reaffirms in the last instances the way things are. As Catherine Belsay notes, classic realism is still the dominant popular mode in literature, film and television drama. It has been denounced as the crudest form of the readerly text and its conventions subverted and parodied by the modern novel, the new novel and postmodern novel. However, the form, like the capitalist mode of production with which it is historically coincident, has shown remarkable resiliency. It will no doubt continue to function, if only antithetically, as one of the chief influences on the development of hypertext fiction. So here ends our discussion about the modernism and a bit of the realism that we will see in modern literature, specifically in narrative literature, novel. Now we need to discuss novel as genre. What are the elements of novel? What are different types of novel that we may see in the modern literature? So starting with how the novel has evolved, and we will search a bit of its history to see how this genre of literature came into being. Since its first appearance in the mid-70s, novels started as a way to preserve oral stories of various cultures and grew to include epics and romances. You definitely would observe that old stories and the old narrative compilation would normally deal with cultural stories of its own time. In the 70s, novels were actually used to spread gossip and other allegations of scandalous behaviors. So it was not reflection of a true story or a cultural story or a traditional story, but a lot more than that, as it was used as a gossip for scandalous and allegation behavior. The authors changed names and claimed the writing was fiction in order to betray secrets while escaping legal consequences. So that is why you would see that normally when people are exaggerating on something and they are saying more than what is real, we have this expression of telling them, oh come on, don't share stories, or don't tell me stories, right? So basically novels started like that. It was a kind of documentation of a story, however more than the story that ever existed. So now let's see some of the definitions, formal definitions. As X.J. Kennedy says, a book-length story in prose whose author tries to create a sense that while we read, we experience actual life. Here Kennedy talks about the perfection of narrative writing that gives the actual experience of its reader. And Percy LeBook says that an imaginary work in prose of a considerable length shouldn't be very short, otherwise it will fall into short stories form. Now this again gives us a question of discriminating what stands as short story and what stands as novel. We will discuss it now. However, it has to be of considerable length, which presents as real, certain characters living in a given environment and describes their attitudes, fate and adventures. It also gives us the categories of different types of themes that a novel can present. And then somebody says that an extended fictional narrative, usually written in prose, is the most common definition that comes to your mind when you are trying to define an act of a narrative or a piece of prose. And then John Gardner calls it that a novel is like a symphony, is that the closing movement echoes and resounds with all that has gone before, documenting past probably. And you will find this definition has glimpses of the spirit of 20th century. Okay, so now the novel is a unique form of prose. We need to understand this, that the novel has 4 unique qualities that set it apart from other types of prose. Prose is of several types, right? So what qualities a piece of narrative, a novel would have that would set it apart as a unique entity. There are 4 unique features, which are its length, it will be of considerable length, emphasis on the character, characters play major part in the story, multiple themes are there, characters in conflict, there has to be some kind of realism. It should not be entirely fancy, it has to be some real aspect of it. Now let us discuss these 4 unique features in a bit of detail. Length is generally 100 pages or more. So the first quality of a novel is its length. Although there are no definite rules, no rule of thumb, no religious limitations that are to be taken care of on the subject of length, it is generally agreed among writers and publishers that the length of the narrative must be 100 pages or more. If it is less than that, it is usually referred to as a novella, such as Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea and George Orwell's Animal Farm. Harper Lee's classic novel To Kill a Mockingbird, for example, contains more than 250 pages. So, emphasis will be on the characters. The second quality of a novel is its emphasis, its limelight, its spotlight is on the characters or characters in the story. Unlike the short story, the length of a novel allows the author to give the reader a much fuller description of the characters and to introduce more than one conflict. Now look at the interconnectivity of these 2 qualities for each other. Since the length is 100 or more pages, it gives the writer enough space and freedom to talk about, give a full description of a character, number 1. Number 2, talk about the conflicts and different themes. Unless a novel is of 100 pages, writer will not have enough space to talk about these things. So since it is this, the first quality leads to the second. Therefore, the reader can better understand the character's motives for action or inaction, relationships with others, and their own personal feelings, dreams, and fears. Now, the third quality, that it will have more than one themes, conflict, point of views, or plots. A novel can't be very simple of keeping one theme or one plot only. The third quality of a novel is its ability to have multiplicity of reality, to include more than one theme or conflicts. The novel's length again allows the author to explore various possibilities. Unless novel is of this theme, unless novel has more than one characters, it won't be that feasible for a writer to explore more than one themes or conflicts. So the first leads to second, and the second quality leads to the third one. And again, they all are equally important and connected to each other. Plot explores characters in conflict. That is the fourth complexity of uniqueness of the characteristics. Unlike the short story, a novel will often have more than one major conflicts within the plot. Often the author is interested in developing a plot in which the main goal is for the character to better understand his or her own humanity or place in society. So often, after discussing the elements of novel and the unique characteristics of novel that set it apart as a different type, we again need to understand those little tiny differences that a type of short story as a narrative and a novel as a narrative type will keep. So if we compare both of these types, we will see that novel has 100,000 or more words, It has many characters, it has complex story type, plot, and deeper understanding of life for individuals. Definitely all of these four things relate to each other. However, on the other end, we have short story, 5,000 words or less, few or one character, focuses on one event, better understanding of an event or character. Okay, so history of the novel now. Oral telling of myths, history, and stories. In 17th century, this is the point where novel comes from. The basics or the primary goals that novel or this genre of literature ever had. This leads to the written storytelling in the form of the epic, exaggerated narratives. Narratives more than what really can be possible. You will see people flying, you will see people with giant faces, you will see giants in human body, and so on and so forth. Written prose fiction concerned with adventure known as the romance. The French word for the novel is roman, right? So this was the third stage in this type of narrative. And finally, it led to written prose fiction concerned with reality or actual life. The English word for new is novel. And this was the later development in the nature of novel in the history of literature. Now, what are those events and movements in the 20th century or before than that played their role in the development of novel as genre of literature? You will see that mid-18th century England was one of the reasons. The society, the culture, and growth of cities due to industrial growth. Ideas and goods are exchanged. New middle class is created from industry. So the Industrial Revolution played its key role in evolving novel into its new form. And these were the four major events that took place and triggered the shaping of novel. So these social and economic changes occurred as a result of the Industrial Revolution, of course, and the colonization of the Americas gave England an abundance of raw materials, which led to the creation of a merchant class, members of which sought their success in the profit made from trading goods. Further, a series of technological changes, such as new machinery, defined what we now call the Industrial Revolution. With it came the growth of cities and a change in the entire social, political, and economic structure in England. Definitely, it was not an individual changing or developing or growing, it was the society that grew into a new society. From the creation of industry, a new social and economic class of people emerged. The middle class was changed into a more sophisticated class that stayed somewhere between the elite class and the middle class of old times. It was a growing class. They gained their wealth through the ownership of factories and the institutions that supported them. Most of them were merchants, thanks to the colonization. So, the birth of the novel, now you will see how all of this is connected. You will see that new market for the novel took birth in 70s. Why? Because more leisure time was available, and now we are talking about the middle class that has evolved into more than middle class, and then increase in the number of people able to read. Since they had leisures, they had free time, they could afford reading, spending money available for entertainment. So drama flourished, novel market flourished because money was available, time was available, peace was available, and this was all because of creation of the new middle class. And that goes back to the Industrial Revolution, and that goes back to, and it's a cycle of growth and development where everything is connected. So this is how the new form of novel has taken its birth. So the focus of modern novel, after knowing the types of the different characteristics of novel, the difference between the short story and novel as genre of literature, and now what is the focus of modern novel, and this highlight will tell you that somehow it has some relevance with the middle class. So the modern novel concerns real problems and real situations, and hence concern the middle class. And we are talking about the early beginnings of 70s. The proper study of mankind is man, and that is Alexander Pope. And Samuel Richardson, Henry Fielding, and these three were the famous philosophers of its own time, and were the founder of the modern English novel. Daniel Defoe, he wrote Robinson Crusoe, Moll Flanders, who born in 1960 and died in 1731, and established a middle-class perspective. And the basic elements of his novel were plot and characters, setting, point of views, and themes. And there we are talking about the beginning of the birth of novel, and that goes back to 17th century. Now, shaping modern literature and modern English novel. The plot is what happens in the story. It has a climax, it has exposition. Conflict in the early novel was person versus society and person versus self. Person versus society is dealing with the characters trapped by circumstances of birth, falsely accused by society, or feels apart from society and discover their own values. They have great expectations. English society during the industrial age, trapped between two worlds, and middle class audience. Now, what are these types of novels that we can study as modern literature? So far what we have discussed regarding novel is something that concern more of its basics. Now we need to understand what different types of novels that modern literature provide us, and the very first type that we are going to start with is the epic. Now, what is the epic? These are the stories and songs emerged as an oral means of communication and preserving the past, tales of heroic battles or struggles, myths or religious beliefs. Beowulf is one big example of an epic demonstration of narrative. In a time before mass communication, the oral tradition enabled people to pass down stories, most often in the form of rhyming poems. So you would, in your own culture, even in Urdu, you will find there are poems which will give you a story of past. I remember in my childhood I would listen to a poem regarding Bahadur Shah Zafar. I don't really remember what were the lines of it, but I remember this was something about his heroic, some heroic event related to this character. So thus the earliest forms of fiction were in fact poetry. Eventually written down, these extended narratives developed into epics, which were long narrative poems about heroic figures whose actions determine the fate of a nation or entire race. What other stories or films do you know of that follow this common theme? That is the question I give you here, not as an assignment, but as an informal assignment, so you may understand and check whether you understand this concept or not. I want you to collect names of different epics, the famous epics of its own time. Now, narrative versus fiction. You would see these buzz names in novel. It's a narrative novel, it's a fiction novel. It's a narrative, it's a fiction. Now, what is this difference about? A narrative tells a story by presenting events in some logical or orderly way. However, a work of fiction is a narrative that for the most part originates in the imagination of the author rather than in history or fact. It has no clear relation with reality. The word fiction comes from the Latin word ficto, which means a shaping of counterfeiting, right? So this is how you can differentiate whether it's a narrative or it's a fiction. Now, these are the types of the novel as well as some techniques that you will find in novels. Maybe a story or narrative is not ironic completely, but irony has used inside as a technique. Although we had discussion on these techniques when we were doing modern drama, however, just to refresh your memory, I quickly go through them during this discussion. There are the three different types of irony: dramatic, verbal, and situational. Now, in dramatic irony, when the reader or audience knows something that the character has yet to realize, is called dramatic irony, and this time I want you to find out the examples. Verbal irony, when the character says the opposite of what is really meant. For example, the reality has been explained in the narrative, however, what the characters are verbalizing is altogether a dichotomy. Situational irony, when something is about to happen to a character or characters who expect the altogether an opposite of it. Allusion, as I discussed before, an allusion is a reference in a text to a person, place, or thing, or fictitious, or it can be fictitious, it can be real. These references are often to literature, history, mythology, or the Bible or religion. Now, protagonist and antagonist, I hope these terms are not new to you, and by now you are pretty sure of them. However, still to refresh your memories, protagonist is the major positive character in the story, and antagonist is the major negative character in the story. Or to make it easy, the protagonist is the central figure in a literary work, and the character usually initiates and is in conflict in the narrative. The antagonist is the character or force that opposes the protagonist in the narrative. Remember, the antagonist may be another character, society itself, a force of nature, or even in modern literature, conflicting impulses within the protagonist. You will find a character within a character that portrays as protagonist. If I can take you to a modern fiction, or for example a movie that you all would have watched, if you remember the Scorpion King, right? The emergence of scorpion inside a human being, and the way it fights with its real self, or if you can recall, Spider-Man and Green Goblet, Spider-Man and Dust Giant, and Spider-Man and you would see that the Green Goblet was not in fact a bad man, but somehow he develops bad characteristics. So it was an antagonist inside a protagonist, and the glimpses that you can see on the screen basically are it's a glimpse, it's a scene, it's a frame from something about future. It's a movie. I cannot recall the name. A Step to Future or A Travel to Future, and I think this movie has 3 parts. It's a trilogy, and this is the second part of that movie. Anyways, Picaresque novel is another type of novel. This type of novel emerged from Spain in the 17th century. And this type of narrative is often told in episodes or adventures, and it is very often a satirical work. These are the two, you see, important features of this. It's a very interesting picture that you can see here. In fact, very interesting. This form of narrative, usually a novel, presents the life of a likable scoundrel or somebody who is at odds with respectable society. The narrator of the Picaresque was originally a picaro, which in Spanish means rascal, and this reminds me of a wonderful movie that I watched recently, The Pirates of the Caribbean Sea, something like that, I guess. I guess it's a good example of it. Epistolary novels. These novels are basically based on letters. A novel in which the story is told by way of letters written by one or more of the characters is a kind of epistolary novel. You will find a wonderful example in E.M. Forster's book of Letters. That's one good example of 20th century epistolary novel. Realism. Realism denotes a period or literally movement. Although we have a detailed discussion of realistic novels or novels based on realism just in the beginning of this talk, but just to add all the types of novels into one big caption, I will redo it. It denotes a period or literary movement of writing wherein writers strove to portray everyday events and people in a realistic fashion. Realism refers to a movement in 19th century, of course, European literature that focused on the middle class rather than aristocracy. It rejected idealism, romanticism, and elitism. You go back to 19th century literature that we discussed and see how realism emerged, why it emerged, why did people feel the need of it, and what cost did they pay in order to present and absorb realistic literature. Then magical realism. This is a different style, genre or movement of writing called magical realism. Is basically marked by its imaginative content, vivid effects, and lingering mystery. It is a type of contemporary narrative that combines the fantastic, magical elements with realistic details. A writer like Gracia can create a fictional world where the miraculous and the everyday live side by side. The world had been sad since Tuesday, or a new movie. I don't know how great it is to give you examples of movie, but I tell you, a movie is a wonderful way of watching through a screen, medium of screen, into the perspectives of a writer and producer who directs a drama on the screen. I recently had a watch of this movie, The Life of Pi. I would say it's an excellent example of magical realism. If you get time, do watch that. Modernism is a movement, is a term, is an entire time period in literature. Basically, it's during the 20th century, the literary movement known as modernism was established by writers, and these writers include Ernest Hemingway, William Faulkner, James Joyce, and Virginia Woolf. These are the writers who reacted to the increasing complexity of a changing world. They claim that world is no more the same. It changes every day. And they had certain reasons to support their claim. They say that there are pressures and passings of old ways under the pressures of modernity. World War I, urbanization, and the rise of industrialism contributed to this literary reaction. So what changes they are talking about, what complexities they are talking about, which are making the old world evolve into a new world or changing world, basically include World War I, urbanization, and the rise of industrialism. These were the major contributors. And then here comes the postmodern literature, postmodernism. After modernism, hence a movement called postmodernism emerged. Postmodern artists reacted to the confines and limitations placed upon form and meaning by opening ideas of interpretation. Many postmodernists confronted with their writing the changing society, the future, and the impact of technology. So what we have now is postmodernism. What is this naturalism? You see there are three figures on the screen. These are called the Pillars of Naturalism. And it says that Freud is dead, Marx is dead, and Darwin isn't feeling very well. Naturalism, sometimes considered an extreme form of realism, rejected unrealistic plots and sentimentality of melodrama. Unlike realism, naturalism sought to explore the depths of the human conditions. Influenced by Freud, Darwin, and Marx, naturalism portrays human beings as higher-order animals who are driven by basic instincts, especially hunger, fear, greed, and sexuality. They say this is natural. Local color, when a writer is considered a local colorist, this writer has used a specific regional material, unique social customs, dress habits, and speech patterns. If a writer includes these things into his or her writing, he is called local colorist. This is one term that I may use in my lecture, so it is better that you know it in advance. Now, in narratives, we have different point of views. After knowing the types of narratives, it's very important for you to know that narratives are in different point of views, and there can be different narrators. The most common three types of narrators are first person pronoun, where I, me, my, mine, we, us, our, or ours is used. I earned my raise. So who is speaking here? The writer is speaking of him or herself. It is good for personal experience and evaluation and opinion. So if this type of point of view is used, you can understand who is the narrator. The one who is talking about experience is basically narrating the event. Second person pronoun, you earned your raise. It's good for instructing or directly addressing readers. However, third person pronoun is good for generalizing, experiencing, or situational discovery. So there are three most common point of views you will find in narratives, in novel mostly. Now, participant narrator is one tricky thing. The participant narrator in a work of literature is written in the first person. Such a character may be a protagonist, or maybe an observer, or minor character standing a little to one side, watching a story unfold that mainly involves someone else. A good example of this is Nick Carraway in Fitzgerald, the Great Gatsby. He is a narrator and minor character who focuses the story on J. Gatsby. Non-participant narrator, on the other hand, is written in third person and can possess different levels of knowledge about characters. Omniscient or all-knowing, seeing into any or all of the character's mind, soul, feelings, and motivations. He can see everything that is hidden from the eye of another common man. He can have limited visibility of reality. A limited omniscience sees into one character, and maybe not everything is visible to him or her. Can be objective, does not see into any character, but merely reports events from outside and reports whatever he or she is seeing the way it is, and does not know the reality. So these were two different types of narrators, participant and non-participant. Now, moving to finally the 20th century novel. The 20th century novel helps us understand our own heritage. It illuminates the human experience. It can be a catalyst for social and political change and documents an event for better understanding. These are the four highlights of 20th century novel. Now, a quick historical review of modern literature. Reasons and impacts, social and cultural. So, just to sum up our talk on this topic, you will see that 20th century introduces a cultural period in which individuals not only reject the past but also question the very basics of knowledge and consider the possibility that knowledge and concepts once thought to be fixed and objective are instead constantly shifting and subjective. you will see the suitability of early philosophies. Philosophers and thinkers such as Nietzsche and Karl Marx and Henry and Sigmund Freud challenged 19th century sense and the positive confidence in its ability to explain both the physical and social worlds in completely rational terms. World War I had a powerful, most influential impact on its aftermath, causing Europeans to reconsider their very belief systems and leading to widespread dissatisfaction with the authorities who many believed were motivated by greed, class exploitation, and hunger for power. Interest in psychology. A growing interest in psychology influenced by the theories of Sigmund Freud contributed to a new emphasis on the literary reality of individuals, the importance of the self and the alienation of the self in modern society. So you can see here we are discussing the highlights, the major contributors of 20th century novel. What were the major contributors? Okay. And then the relationship between reality and experience, realism. New studies in the relationship between reality and experience led to the philosophies of phenomenology and existentialism, two buzz terms for philosophies of the time, as represented in the philosophical writings of Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre. And then World War II. After the Second World War, the rise of communism, the gradual disintegration of colonialism, and the exponential development of technology, existentialism flourished in the 1940s. After 1940s, we are having two novelists that we will discuss. So you will see this effect deeply embedded in their writings, in E.M. Forster writings and in William Golding's writings. In 1950, as individuals struggled to find meaning in an increasingly fragmented and confused world. And then cultural procrealism, a tongue twister rather, a growing awareness of a variety of other cultures that have differing worldviews than traditional European or American ones undercut the assumption of cultural procrealism and led to pluralistic and post-colonial perspective. Now, with the advent of technology, with the development, with the world emerging into a global village, awareness is growing and a variety of other cultures are coming close to each other. So it is taking people out of their assumptions and leading them to a pluralistic view or a post-colonial perspective for that matter. So this makes us to have a final word about the 20th century literature. Okay, so after this detailed discussion about the 20th century literature, the type of narrative, the genre, novel itself, the types of novels, different types of techniques used in that, different types of viewpoints used in this narrative, we have come to the conclusive part of the discussion that deals with the 20th century literature as a whole. So 20th century literature basically dealt with different aspects which are unique in the nature. For example, they started in language game, adapting the theories of linguists and philosophers such as Ferdinand Saussure and Wittgenstein. 20th century writers begin to treat language as a game, creating fragmented word combinations, ambiguous meanings and experimental forms, to experiment with language as an expression of reality and thinking that they can explore new ventures. Literary movements played a very important role, as Dadaism and Surrealism were among the most influential early 20th century literary movements. The goal of the Dadaist was to abolish the restraints of authority by breaking the conventions of literature and art. The goal of the Surrealist was to express the unconscious mind through dream writing, automatic writing, and fantasy. So these two movements are very important to observe the change of literature from 19th to 20th century. The use of imagery is one of the highlights of the characteristics of this time. Although the term modernism generally refers to the collective literary trend in the early 20th century, it more precisely applies to a group of British and American writers such as James Joyce, Ezra Pound, T.S. Eliot, who crafted carefully worded images in colloquial language. The vivid nature of the language used by these writers will let you understand what is the use of imagery in 20th century. So in the broadest sense of modernism, early 20th century writers broke up the traditional plot structure of narratives, experimented with language, fragmented ideas, played with shifting perspectives, and drew self-conscious attention to the very nature of language itself. So, one of the major achievements of this time, as they call it, is rediscovery of the meaning. The meaning is not as simple as it seems to be. Despite the experiments with style and content, early modernists continued to hope that through art they could rediscover the meaning and unity lost in modern society. By mid-century, a growing number of writers, often referred to as post-modernist, abandon that hope and begin instead to create literature that celebrates rather than laments the inability of language, and literature to bring conclusion and meaning to the modern experience. So, altogether it was a challenge to fixed notions. Postmodern writers playfully create allusions as well as illusions, contradictions, narratives, meta-narratives, and linguistic games in order to disrupt reader expectations of fixed objective references, in order to broaden the view of meaning and of reality itself. And we understand that cultural diversity is another important reason, as well as I will say it's not only a cause, it's also an effect of its own nature. At the end of the 20th century, as geopolitical boundaries blurred and shifted, an increased recognition of the diversity of cultural identities in ethnic, gender, and sexual issues led to a correspondent pluralism in writing that depicts the full range of human diversity. Included in these new perspectives is attention to the efforts of post-colonial cultures to develop a consciousness apart from that of their colonizers. This was all about today's lecture. I guess the lecture 1 and lecture 2 prepare enough ground and rich grounds for you now to absorb the spirit of 20th century novel. So what we discussed so far in lecture 2, basically, we dealt with a conclusive talk based on modernism and realism, and then we moved on to discuss the elements of novel, unique form of novel, history of British novel, focus of modern novel, and types of modern novel. This was all for today's lecture, lecture 2. Inshallah, I will see you in the next talk. Allah Hafiz.